So in this video, I want to go through some of the limits to the terms of trade argument from the previous video. Now, in the previous video, we mentioned or we showed that if you can impose a tariff and the incidence of the tariff is borne mostly by foreign producers in the form of lower prices. Okay, so just to clarify, incidence is equal to the amount of the tariff paid by either consumers or producers. Okay, so in this case, the incidence of the tariff, right? There's a very large incidence here, right? This is the incidence of the tariff paid by the domestic producers in the form of lower prices, and the incidence that domestic consumers pay is relatively small. So notice how this distance between PW and P minus, or to put it more formally, PW minus P minus is far bigger than P plus minus PW. Okay, this is the amount of the tariff that foreign producers pay because they get to keep a smaller amount of the price. And this is the amount of the tariff that we as domestic consumers pay in the form of slightly higher prices. Okay, so notice that prices fell to foreign producers a lot more than they rose to domestic consumers. Okay, now this is true if we're talking about a very large country. So it only works for large economies, right? In small economies, what we'll see, or we tend to see, oops, there should be a P, thank you. What we tend to see is if they impose a tariff, let me finish drawing across. What we tend to see is P minus being only slightly lower and P plus being, much higher. So here, for small economies, what tends to happen is the incidence of P plus minus PW tends to be far greater than PW minus P minus. Okay, and in that case, then the deadweight loss triangles are going to be far bigger than this additional revenue from foreign producers. Okay, so here in small economies, the deadweight loss triangles associated with a tariff more closely resemble the arguments, the efficiency arguments that free trade people tend to make. Okay, so the idea is that not only does the tariff have to be relatively small so that it doesn't, prevent international trade and result in zero imports, but it also has to be imposed by a large economy because there the large economy is able to pass off the greater amount of the incidence onto foreign producers. Okay, the other argument or the other limit I want to put forth is that other countries can do this too. Okay, so think about if the U.S. So let's use the U.S. and Canada since that's currently in the news. This is May of 2017. So President Trump is apparently trying to renegotiate NAFTA. Okay, and so the idea is that if we raise tariffs on Canadian products, well, Canada can raise tariffs on us. Okay, so what happens is if we raise our tariffs, right, then Canadian citizens will pay some of our tax bill in the form of this additional tax revenue from their producers. But at the same time, they can raise their tariffs and force our producers to pay some of their tax bill. Okay, and if it's the case that we raise our tariffs, they might respond by raising their tariffs, and that sets off what we know as a trade war. Okay, so a trade war is basically two countries retaliating against one another with trade policies. Okay, so this is, they're basically playing, tit for tat, whereby, if the US raises their tariffs, then Canada responds by raising their tariffs, right? And if Canada raises their tariffs, well, we're going to play, raise our tariffs, and then Canada raises their tariffs again, and it's sort of a gradual increase in the rate of tariff between these two countries, okay? So those are the two major arguments for limits to the idea of using tariffs to basically pass off some of the tax burden onto foreign countries. The idea is that it only works for large economies, and if we're too aggressive with it, other countries will respond with their own tariffs to us, right? Which means that while it's true that we're paying less taxes to our domestic government, we may end up be paying essentially more taxes to foreign governments, okay? And so that is sort of the essence of the limits to this, and why we tend to have low tariff rates, not just because having low tariff rates, maximizers is optimal, but it may even be optimal if you recall this graph here, right? So if we say, this is, the T star, right? This is a world where no, responses happen at all. If there is a trade, if we, let's say we have something like this, we'll call this, T1, right? If we, let's say we go above T1, so if we go above T1, some, tariff rate, then trade war, right? We may end up stopping at T1 just so that we can prevent this trade war, because if we have a trade war, that could shift all of this down really low. So even though some of the welfare economists may argue that we should raise tariffs beyond what they are right now, there may be arguments for not going, from T1 to T star, if going from T1 to T star or going anywhere above T1 will start a trade war, okay? This, incidentally, is why we have international agreements. Right, so international trade agreements like NAFTA and the TPP, right, at least it's, what it's designed to do. And I haven't read either of these to comment on whether or not they're successful or good ideas or anything. But in principle, the idea behind them is to basically try to say, okay, look, we all recognize that if we, if we set our tariffs too high, then, that'll start a trade war. So how about we set our tariff rates together, we work together, and we agree on them so that we don't start going back and forth with the trade war. Okay, the idea of international trade agreements is to set tariff rates, essentially, together, and thereby prevent a trade war. Okay, so this doesn't mean that the tariff rates have to be equal. Okay, so U.S. and Canada have different tariff rates for each other. Okay, but when we entered into NAFTA, we entered into an agreement that said, what the U.S. tariff rate for Canada would be, and what the tariff rate for Canada when they buy something from the U.S., what that tariff rate would be. We sat down and agreed with each other on what we were going to tax each other. Okay, And so that's basically the idea here, right? Is that we have the efficiency argument, or the terms of trade argument, excuse me, is it seems at least a valid extension of the efficiency argument, but it has its limits, okay? And so recognizing those limits can help us make a little bit more sense of the real world that we find ourselves in today.